The clay soil of Mississippi turned to red mud under the October rain of 1943. At Camp Clinton, 15 miles east of the state capital, German prisoners of war stepped from cattle cars onto American ground for the first time. Their boots, worn thin from the North African campaign, sank into earth that smelled of pine sap and delta soil. The barbed wire perimeter stretched before them like a question mark. These men who had marched across France, who had fought Rommel's war in the sand, now stood in a place whose name they could barely pronounce, surrounded by forests so thick the horizon disappeared into green, the establishment of camp. Clinton represented something unprecedented in the machinery of global conflict. By autumn 1943, the United States found itself custodian to hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, men captured in Tunisia, Sicily, and the bloody Italian advance. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment. Geography demanded practical solutions. And so the American South, with its mild winters and vast rural spaces, became an archipelago of prison camps stretching from Texas to the Carolinas. Camp Clinton materialized in Hinds County, not through strategic importance, but through availability 1,200 acres of former farmland. Close enough to rail lines for transport, far enough from population centers to satisfy security concerns, and sufficiently isolated that escape would mean wandering through swampland and sharecropper, fields where German accent would echo like a gunshot. The Wehrmacht soldiers who arrived that October carried with them expectations forged in propaganda and bitter experience. They had been told in training camps from Bavaria to Brandenburg that Americans were soft, undisciplined, corrupted by jazz music and mongrel democracy. They expected brutality because brutality was what they knew. The Russian front had taught them that prisoners were liabilities, mouths to feed in a landscape of starvation. And the stories that filtered back from the east spoke of forced marshes and mass graves. Some expected execution. Others, having surrendered in North Africa where Patton's forces had surrounded them in the final collapse of the Afrika Corps, expected at minimum the harsh rations and overcrowded conditions they themselves had imposed on Allied prisoners in the desert. They stood in formation on the muddy Mississippi ground, back straight despite exhaustion, and waited for the America they had been promised to reveal itself, the America of their officers' contemptuous lectures, the America that was supposed to be weak, desperate, already losing a war fought on too many fronts. What they encountered instead arrived on metal trays in a mess hall that smelled of fresh paint and coffee. The first meal at Camp Clinton has entered the documented record through dozens of prisoner testimonies collected after the war. Accounts that share a quality of disbelief so consistent it reads like collective hallucination. Daldweibel, helmet to knee, a tank commander captured at Kasserine Pass, recorded in his diary, "We were given white bread, not the sawdust loaves of the fatherland butter. Actual butter in quantities I have not seen since before the war. Potatoes, meat that was identifiable as meat. And coffee, real coffee." The guards stood and watched us eat as if this were normal. Another prisoner, whose name appears in Red Cross records only as Schreiber, wrote to his family in a letter that would not reach them until 1946. "They feed us better than our own officers ate in Africa. There is waste here, food thrown away that would feed a platoon for days. I do not understand this country." The cognitive dissonance was total and immediate. These were men who had left a Germany where ration cards determined survival, where ersatz coffee made from acorns was a luxury, where the fat content of sausages had been declining since 1940. They had fought in North Africa, eating canned sardines and stale bread while watching their supply lines crumble under Allied air superiority. And now they sat in Mississippi, prisoners of war, eating portions that exceeded anything they had known as free men serving the Reich. The symbolism was inescapable and intentional. American abundance was not merely economic fact, but psychological weapon. A daily demonstration that the ideology they had served was built on lies about scarcity, about the necessity of conquest. about Lebensraum and the zero-sum mathematics of survival. Camp Clinton itself sprawled across the Mississippi landscape like a small town materialized overnight. The compound consisted of 42 barracks constructed in the standard Army cantonment style. Wooden frames with tar paper roofing, each building capable of housing 60 men in double-bunked efficiency. The camp hospital occupied a separate quadrant, staffed by American medics and 2 captured German doctors who had volunteered their services. Recreation facilities included a soccer field, volleyball courts, and a library stocked initially with agricultural texts and German classics vetted by military censors. The perimeter was secured by 8 guard towers manned 24 hours, searchlights that turned night into perpetual dusk, and enough barbed wire to stretch from Clinton to Jackson and back. Yet within these confines, a strange inverted normalcy took root. Prisoners received pay for labor 80 cents per day in camp script, negotiable at the canteen for cigarettes, toiletries, and writing materials. They elected their own camp leadership, organized language classes, formed soccer teams, and staged theatrical productions in a recreation, all built by their own labor. The work itself became another source of profound disorientation. Under Geneva Convention protocols, enlisted prisoners could be required to work. Officers could not. The vast majority at Camp Clinton were enlisted men, and they were deployed throughout Central Mississippi in labor details that addressed the severe agricultural shortage created by American mobilization. Cotton fields that had been worked by sharecroppers, now sent to factories or drafted into service, needed hands for harvest. Logging operations in the piney woods required workers. Infrastructure projects, road maintenance, even some manufacturing, all these drew on the prisoner workforce. German soldiers who had invaded Poland and France, but he knew timber better than any man I had met. He was fair. When it rained, we sheltered together, and he shared his tobacco. Everything we had been told was a lie. The food, always the food, remained the central, recurring proof of that lie. Camp Clinton's mess hall operated on the same supply chain that fed American troops. And while portions were theoretically controlled to prevent waste, the reality was that prisoners ate better than most German civilians and better than many Wehrmacht soldiers still fighting in Italy or Russia. Breakfast meant eggs, bacon or sausage, toast with jam and coffee. Lunch brought sandwiches made with actual meat, fruit, and milk. Dinner rotated through beef, pork, chicken, accompanied by vegetables, bread, and dessert cake, pie, pudding, luxuries that had vanished from German tables years earlier. The camp canteen sold chocolate bars, chewing gum, and Coca-Cola, items that existed in prisoner memory as pre-war fantasies. Otto Schiller, a former lance corporal, wrote in his memoir published in 1958, "We gained weight. Men who had been skeletal from dysentery in the desert became healthy again. We joked that we were being fattened for slaughter, but we knew the truth was stranger. America had so much that even its enemies ate well. This abundance extended beyond food into aspects of life that transformed daily existence. The camp library expanded to include technical manuals, engineering texts, and eventually even some contemporary literature. Prisoners formed study groups, preparing for the civilian lives they would eventually resume in a post-war Germany they could barely imagine. The Camp Theater Company produced Goethe's Faust in December 1943, performing for an audience of 2,000 prisoners and select American officers. The sets were elaborate, the costumes sewn by prisoners with theatrical experience, the ambition undimmed by captivity. In home letters that passed through multiple censor checkpoints but still conveyed essential truths, prisoners described a paradox. They were imprisoned but learning, defeated but fed, captured but in some strange way freer than they had been in the Wehrmacht. The relationship between prisoners and guards evolved along unexpected trajectories. The American soldiers assigned to Camp Clinton were, in many cases, men deemed unfit for combat deployment, too old, too young, medically restricted, or simply unlucky in the vast lottery of wartime assignment. Some were themselves sons of German immigrants, speaking enough of the language to communicate beyond commands. The initial posture was professional distance. Guards maintained order. Prisoners obeyed rules, and the barbed wire marked the boundary of two worlds. But proximity and routine eroded formal barriers. Guards and prisoners discovered shared interests: soccer, chess, music. American soldiers would sometimes trade cigarettes for German craftswork, small wooden sculptures or carved items that prisoners made in the camp workshop. Some guards, especially those who had never traveled beyond Mississippi before the war, found themselves curious about Europe, asking questions about cities they had only read about in newspapers. The prisoners, in turn, learned about America from men who embodied it: farm boys from the Delta, factory workers from Meridian, college students from Ole Miss whose educations had been interrupted by the draft. Yet, beneath the surface, accommodation ran deeper currents of transformation. The prisoners at Camp Clinton were not monolithic in ideology. Some remained committed Nazis, true believers who saw their captivity as temporary setback and an ultimate victory. They maintained internal discipline, intimidated waverers, and clung to Hitler's promises of wonder weapons and final triumph. But others, perhaps the majority, began the slow, painful process of ideological disintegration. How could they reconcile what they saw daily: the waste, the abundance, the casual generosity of a system they had been told was failing with everything they had been taught about racial superiority and the weakness of democracy? A prisoner named Karl Muller recalled, "I had believed we were the master race. I had believed Americans were soft, mixed blood, incapable of sacrifice. And then I watched them build an entire city in the wilderness to house us, their enemies. I watched them feed us from their own plenty, while their sons died in Europe fighting us. The mathematics did not work. Either we had been lied to, or reality itself was false. The transformation was not universal or simple. Some prisoners left Camp Clinton in 1946 as convinced Nazis as they arrived. But camp records, post-war interviews, and the scattered memoirs published decades later suggest that for many, Mississippi marked the beginning of what German intellectuals would later call Vergangenheitsbottel wrestling with the past, the reckoning with complicity and delusion. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. If America, this supposed mongrel democracy, could produce such wealth that even prisoners ate better than civilians in the fatherland, then what did that say about the Third Reich's promises? If Black Americans, whom Nazi ideology deemed subhuman, could supervise work details with competence and even kindness, then what remained of racial theory? The questions accumulated like compound interest, and the answers, when they came, were devastating to the worldview. These men had carried into war. The symbolic power of small things resonated throughout the camp experience. Consider the Hershey bar rectangular block of chocolate wrapped in brown paper, sold at the camp canteen for 5 cents in scrip. To American soldiers, it was mundane, a taste of home, something to accompany a cigarette. To German prisoners, it represented something close to miracle. Chocolate had been rationed to near invisibility in Germany since 1939. The real article, not the carat-based substitute, existed in memory as peacetime luxury. And here it was, available for pocket change to prisoners of war. Men would save their canteen scrip for weeks to buy multiple bars, not to eat, but to send home in care packages. Tangible proof that they had somehow fallen through a looking glass into a world where the laws of scarcity did not apply. Letters from German families receiving these packages speak of disbelief. You must be lying. You cannot have access to such things. Are you truly a prisoner? The chocolate became symbol and proof, evidence that the narrative of the war. Christmas 1944 saw elaborate celebrations, prisoners decorating barracks with handmade ornaments, singing carols in German while American guards stood nearby humming along to melodies that transcended language. The irony was noted by camp chaplain Captain Robert Morrison. They sing Silent Night. Composed in Austria, and we sing it too, and for 3 minutes the war does not exist. By early 1945, the character of new arrivals began to shift. These were not the Afrika Korps veterans of 1943, but men captured in the Rhineland. in the Battle of the Bulge and the final desperate fighting as Allied armies closed on Berlin. They arrived shocked, traumatized, and many were younger teenagers conscripted in the war's last gasps, boys who had known only Nazi Germany and total war. The older prisoners at Camp Clinton became their educators, teaching them not just English or agricultural skills, but harder lessons about the world beyond propaganda. When the young ones arrived, recalled Hans Becker in a 1980 interview, we had to tell them the truth. That Germany was losing. That Hitler had lied. That America was not what we had been told. Some refused to believe, but they could see the food, the medicine, the fact that we were not beaten or starved. Reality is a powerful teacher. The end came in stages. Germany's surrender in May 1945 was met with relief more than celebration relief, that the dying would stop, that perhaps return home might be possible. But repatriation was not immediate. The logistics of returning millions of prisoners, the political calculations of occupation, and the devastation of Europe meant that German prisoners would remain in American camps for months or years after the war's official conclusion. At Camp Clinton, the population actually increased as prisoners were consolidated from smaller facilities. The work continued, Mississippi still needed labor, and the prisoners needed occupation. But the tone shifted subtly. These were no longer enemy combatants, but former enemies, men in limbo between the war they had lost and the peace they could not yet imagine. The reckoning with abundance continued even after hostilities ceased. In the summer of 1945, with Germany occupied and divided, prisoners at Camp Clinton began to receive letters from home that painted a picture of devastation, cities in ruins. Food shortages approaching famine levels, the social order collapsed. A letter from one prisoner's mother, preserved in the camp chaplain's records, reads, "We eat potato peelings and count ourselves lucky. There is no meat, no eggs, no coffee. The Americans give us rations, but it is barely enough. You write to me of steaks and desserts, and I think you must be hallucinating from hunger. But then I remember you are the prisoner, and we are the free. And I do not know what words mean anymore." The distance between Camp Clinton's abundance and Germany's devastation became a chasm that defined the prisoner experience. They were eating better than their families, living in more security than their mothers and sisters. The guilt was overwhelming for some. Others felt a cold clarity. This was what losing a total war meant. And this was what America's industrial capacity could accomplish. Repatriation began in earnest in 1946. Prisoners were processed in groups, given medical examinations, issued clothing and a small amount of cash, and shipped from Mississippi to ports of embarkation, and then across the Atlantic to a Germany many barely recognized. Camp Clinton's population declined through the spring and summer. The final group left in November 1946, 4 years after the first arrivals. The camp was decommissioned rapidly, barracks dismantled, equipment sold as surplus, the land returned to agricultural use. Within 2 years, little physical evidence remained that 1,200 acres of Hinds County had housed thousands of German soldiers. But the human evidence, the psychological transformation worked in that unlikely place, would echo through generations. The men who passed through Camp Clinton carried their Mississippi experience back to a shattered Germany facing occupation, division, and the slow construction of new political identities. In the decades that followed, historians began documenting what came to be understood as the POD effect, the observation that German prisoners, who had spent the war years in American camps, returned with fundamentally altered perspectives on democracy, capitalism, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence. They had seen in daily practice that the caricature of America as weak and decadent was false. They had experienced abundance not as theft from conquered territories, but as the product of industrial capacity and agricultural efficiency. They had witnessed a multiracial democracy that, for all its flaws and contradictions, functioned with a pragmatism that put ideology to shame. These men became, in many cases, some of the strongest advocates for West German reconstruction along democratic and market-oriented lines. The chocolate bars and white bread of camp. Clinton had accomplished what no propaganda could they had, demonstrated that another way of organizing society was not only possible, but demonstrably more successful. The symbolic resonance of that Mississippi experience crystallized around a single recurring image in Prisoner, memoirs and oral histories, the Sunday dinner. At Camp Clinton, as at most POW camps, Sunday meals were special larger portions, better cuts of meat, desserts that approached celebration. Prisoners would dress in their best available clothing, clean themselves thoroughly, and approach the mess hall with a formality that bordered on ritual. The meal itself was abundant, almost absurdly so by European standards of 1944 or 1945. But more than the food, the ritual represented something about American culture these men had never understood from outside. Abundance was not hoarded but shared, not weaponized but casually distributed. Not a privilege of rank but an expectation of. The lesson was written in every meal, every Hershey bar, every pair of new boots issued to replace worn out WEARMACT equipment. The epilogue of Camp Clinton extends far beyond its November 1946 closure. The site itself returned to farmland, then to suburban development as Jackson's metropolitan area expanded eastward. By the 1960s, strip malls and residential neighborhoods covered the ground where barracks had stood. A small historical marker, erected in 1985, notes the camp's existence in language so neutral it could describe a summer retreat rather than a prisoner of war facility. But the real legacy lives in the scattered testimonies of men who spent their youth in Mississippi captivity and their old age in a democratic Germany they helped rebuild. They carried with them the memory of abundance, the confusion of being treated humanely by enemies, the slow dissolution of certainties they had been taught since childhood in a vast accounting of World War II. Camp Clinton appears as the smallest of footnotes, a temporary installation in a secondary theater, housing prisoners who never again saw combat, producing no battles worth naming and no strategic shifts worth noting. Yet in the transformation of individual consciousness, in the quiet work of ideological conversion accomplished not through coercion, but through the daily demonstration of an alternative reality, Camp Clinton represents something profound about how wars are truly won, not just on battlefields through superior firepower, but in the hearts and minds of defeated soldiers who returned home carrying the knowledge that everything they had fought. For it was built on lies that could not survive, contact with Mississippi's abundance, the red clay, mud that greeted those first prisoners in October 1943, has long since been paved over, covered by the ordinary sprawl of American development. But somewhere in Germany, now decades removed from war, there may still live men who remember the taste of that first meal at Camp Clinton, the cognitive shock of white bread and butter and real coffee, the slow unraveling of ideology in the face of undeniable plenty. They are old now, those men, grandfathers and great-grandfathers, in a unified Germany that exists because men like them learned, in prisoner of war camps scattered across the American South, that the future did not have to resemble the past, that abundance did not require conquest, and that democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could deliver what totalitarianism only promised. The barbed wire is gone, the barracks are dust. But the lesson persists. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that feeds. Not the force that conquers, but the system that provides. Not the ideology that promises everything, but the reality that delivers enough. Camp Clinton, Mississippi, October 1943 to November 1946. A footnote that changed minds. A prison that freed perspectives. A small piece of earth where the true cost of ideology met the undeniable evidence of its alternative. And where the war's real victory was written not in territory, gained but in certainties lost in futures reimagined over Sunday. Dinner in a mess hall that no longer exists but whose memory. endures in the architecture of reconciliation.